Welcome to Khanversations. I'm Muqtedar, your host, and today we have with us on Khanversations one of the most distinguished scholars of Middle East. We have with us Dr. Shibley Telhami. He's the Anwar Sadat professor at University of Maryland in College Park. He has also been for a long time a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institute. And I have been a big admirer of Dr. Telhami's work because first of all, he has one leg in academia and one leg in the policy community. I have learned a lot from him. I was a fellow at the Brookings for a few years, and I learned a lot from the way he balanced his policy work with his academic work. But what I admire most is long after he was tenured, he was still publishing in peer-reviewed journals, and I don't see many senior scholars doing that. So I'm absolutely delighted to have you on Khanversations, Dr. Telhami.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to know you and follow you as well.
Before I go ahead and tell you what I'm going to do, which is to discuss this new book that has just come out, and Dr. Telhami is one of the co-editors of this book, The One State Reality. I would like you to do some office business, which is, if you have not subscribed to Khanversations already, please subscribe to it. Make sure you ring the bell icon so you get notifications of future videos. Like the video, and this is a very important topic that needs wider attention, so please share it with your social, academic, political, and friends and network. So the book that you're talking about is The One State Reality, What is Israel-Palestine? And the way Israel-Palestine is written with a hyphen, a forward slash, is to indicate that we are talking about one entity, and we're trying to describe what this one entity is. It's edited by Professor Shibley Telhami and what I like to call as the GW gang, consisting of Michael Barnett, Nathan Brown, and Mark Lynch. And I didn't know that Mark Lynch was your student. I saw your video about this book, and I realized that you were an academic advisor. We are also.
I'm proud of it. I'm proud of him being a student. He's actually the first student, my first PhD student at Cornell University.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. And he's one of the most important voices on Arab politics. I'll also be talking about this article, which is based on the book with some variations, called Israel's One State Reality. It's in the current Foreign Affairs. You can read it on the web. And I think it will be in the May-June issue of the physical copy of Foreign Affairs, which is one of the most influential journals on international affairs in the world. So Professor Telhami, let me start with an easy question. What has changed? What has changed that you feel that people are going to be able to recognize that the reality of Israel and Palestine is that of one state, and which has essentially made the possibility of a two-state solution as envisioned in the Middle East peace process next to impossible? So what are the fundamental things that has changed that will allow a lot of people to realize the reality of Palestine and Israel?
Well, I think there are a lot of things that have changed, obviously. I think there was at one point, certainly dating back to the Oslo agreements in the 1990s, all the way until they collapsed in 2000, there was a genuine hope that there would be an end coming to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a solution that was acceptable to both, a two-state solution, a state of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza, and then the state of Israel living side by side in peace. I mean, that was certainly a hope, and it was somewhat justified in the 1990s. I mean, there were coalitions in Israel among Palestinians pushing forth. There was an international position pushing forth. There's an American foreign policy pushing for it. And honestly, since the collapse of those negotiations in 2000, there's been a lot more pessimism. And that pessimism was overshadowed by other huge events like 9/11 and the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, things that have overshadowed Israel, Palestine, even as pessimism was creeping in. And then finally, obviously, when the U.S. began disengaging and this issue is rising again, there was a realization that two states is is nowhere on the horizon. That a half a century had passed, now more than a half a century had passed on the Israeli occupation of Palestinians, still under occupation with no horizon for peace, and it's taken for granted that nothing could happen. In the meanwhile, you've had an increasing the rise of increasingly right-wing Israel. You see that in terms of Israeli public opinion, in terms of the dominant coalitions in Israeli politics, the disappearance of the left, and on top of that, the rise of an influential school of Jewish supremacy, meaning of the land belonging principally to the Jews. The Palestinians are not welcome there. Certainly, the far right coalition, people who had been in the past marginal to Israeli politics, who've become part of Israeli government in recent months. And the very rise of that far right Israeli government in the past few months had further shifted. It's not the cause of why people have reached that conclusion. Obviously, we as scholars have started this project 4 years ago, long before the rise of the far right government in Israel, but we could see the trends headed in that direction. So I think with it, you can see that not just scholars have become more pessimistic about the likelihood of a two-state solution. We've been measuring that for a while, but even the public had become somewhat more pessimistic about a two-state solution in the United States, at least, and certainly globally. So I think the environment has shifted, and I think that people may disagree on what is, quote, the solution is, or how to describe the current reality. But I don't think it's much of a struggle to argue that it's a one-state reality now, and that has consequences. That really is something that we needed to do as scholars when we started this project about 4 years ago. A lot of people had been arguing it. There were some scholars like Jan Lustig who had argued that it's a one-state reality already, but that had not taken hold. And we had, sort of as scholars, the four of us who initiated this project and invited a dozen other scholars to think about it at the University of Maryland and George Washington University. I think we very quickly coalesced on describing it as a one-state reality, and we did that with a lot of intellectual rigor. We didn't reach that conclusion at the outset. We had to figure out. In fact, the original project was called "What is Israel-Palestine?" It wasn't the one-state reality. We weren't sure we were going to coalesce around that. So it was a question about how we as political scientists, all four of us were political scientists, and most of the people who we've invited to participate were political scientists. We had to struggle to figure out how do we define it, given how it's been defined by us as political scientists in the past, how the world sees it, and I can obviously tell you what our thinking was on it and why we reached that, but there's no question that we very quickly reached that conclusion.
One of the more interesting political theoretical departure in the book is the discussion of the concept of sovereignty and the principle of sovereignty. And one idea that seems to come out of the book is that you are separating the state and sovereignty, while political theorists have often argued that sovereignty is a constitutive element of the state. It is the sovereignty that makes the state. But you're arguing, and it has also a further interesting corollary where you actually talk about Palestinians as having sovereignty, but not the state, and Israel having a state which extends into territories which are designated for the Palestinian state, but exercising sovereignty on these two territories. So could you speak to the debates and the discussions and the thought process about how you felt the need to rethink this concept of sovereignty?
Well, our issue was to figure out why most of us have sustained this view of what exists on the ground, which is that you have a state of Israel in its pre-1967 border with recognized statehood and sovereignty over those territories pre-1967, and then the occupied territories, which is the West Bank and Gaza, that were temporarily occupied. And despite the fact that, as you know, occupation is intended as a temporary status, in fact, the resolutions following the 1967 and 1973 wars called for, quote, immediate withdrawal. And obviously it's been more than a half a century and since the initial occupation, and obviously no end in sight. So it's not, it stretches the meaning of the term occupation as it's understood. But one reason for that has been that, it was seen through the eyes of sovereignty. Israel does not have sovereignty over any parts of the territory occupied in 1967, even ones that it claims sovereignty over, like East Jerusalem, right? That's not recognized internationally. It does not, from the point of view of the international community, it does not have sovereignty over East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is still occupied territories in the eyes of the international community. It's just Israel asserts that, but that's hardly recognized by a handful of states only, that it's a recognition. So that's why I think a lot of people were kind of saying, well, no, it's not one state. I mean, there's this sovereign part and there's this non-sovereign part. And our point was, well, look, states is really about control. It's about, to go to the Weberian notion of what a state is. It is about a monopoly or semi-monopoly in the use of force and control of borders. And if you look at the entire territory from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, Israel really controls the borders and the skies. And has near monopoly on the use of force. Never a perfect monopoly, obviously, and there's some autonomy for Palestinians in some sections like Gaza and the West Bank. But in general, they have no independent access to the outside world, and the territories are controlled. So our thinking was that no, there is a difference between state and sovereignty. State is about control of territories. Sovereignty is about the outside world recognizing the legality of that control. And once you make that leap, it's not hard to assess that it's a one state. But the differentiation from sovereignty is extremely important, meaning it's not legally recognized. So when we say this reality must be recognized, we're not calling for the international community to recognize it as legal, because the international community will not do that, unlikely to do that, and probably shouldn't do that in terms of, certainly not in the current configuration where you have an unjust reality. We're not celebrating the one state. We're painfully recognizing the one state because it's an unjust reality, and we could talk about describing what that reality is. But so it is not, we're not looking at this as a solution. We're looking at this as we need to put in a new pair of glasses to assess what exists in those territories and pass judgments, both strategic judgments, judgments about what should be done, but also moral judgments about what now exists in those territories using the prism of that one state. Now, with regard to the sovereignty, it still matters for two reasons. It not only matters because sovereignty recognition of the one state or Israeli control over that one state is unlikely to come, but it also means that things like settlement building, people think that if you recognize one state, then suddenly settlements are okay. It's one state. If it's one state, why Israel can't build settlements in the West Bank? No, because that's a judgment that's passed through the prism of sovereignty. The fact that Israeli settlements are illegal under international law had nothing to do with the prospect of two states. In fact, the illegality of settlements preceded even the prospect of two states in Israel, Palestine. In the morning after 1967, when nobody thought two states were likely or possible, settlements were absolutely illegal. They're illegal because international law prohibits the construction of settlements in occupied territories. And so the fact is that the international community, especially the US, the use of justification of opposing settlements, of saying it undermines the prospects of two states, well, that's a political decision to be made that was like more of a smokescreen that diverted attention from the fact that settlements were illegal under international law. Whether or not you have two states possible, whether or not it is a one-state reality or at the moment, that's the judgment through the prism of international law. So it's very important to create this differentiation between state and sovereignty. And I think that's the mechanism that we've used to understand what's happening on the ground.
I read that a couple of times, that part, and to me, there was something troubling about it. And I said, this is a very sophisticated lens that you're asking people to wear. And I think people who are not familiar, at least at the graduate level, with the concept of sovereignty will struggle to understand why we need the reality and the brutality of the occupation and the inhumane way in which Palestinians are treated on a daily basis by Israel is readily apparent to ordinary observers, to journalists, to policymakers. But the book is demanding a highly more sophisticated point of view, lenses, which may actually act as a barrier to people to see what you want them to see. And on a second point that I have on this issue is that, of course, if you treat Israel, Palestine as one state, then of course, on the democracy index, it's going to go down rapidly into authoritarian and even dictatorial regime category rather than a struggling democracy as it is rated right now. But you're also saying that Israel, by treating this as a one state, we will demand accountability on the state of Israel without allowing it the privileges that one state would enjoy, such as building settlements inside its borders. And that's probably where I think your critiques are going to come and say that you're demanding accountability without extending sovereignty.
Yeah, and I think that, just to go into the complexity of this argument, the book itself was intended really to kind of create a conversation in our political science field. That's why we have, principally invited political scientists, but also a few other social scientists and analysts to the conversation, because we thought that the paradigmatic shift needs to take place among our colleagues. So this book obviously was intended, to engage the scholars, even though obviously a lot of people are picking it up because it has broader. We clearly want to engage the public conversation, as we did in the foreign affairs piece, where it's basically a sophisticated but still more generalist foreign policy audience that are not necessarily going to be academics, or for that matter, even people who know a lot about the Middle East. So therefore, we still mention that in our analysis in the foreign affairs piece, but we have not really had a lot of pushback on this differentiation that you're suggesting. I think that it isn't a particularly surprising thing, because we've had states, or entities that were held responsible for the territories they control, even if they didn't have recognized sovereignty by international system. So it's not as odd as it sounds to you, but clearly people are going to raise that question. And but for us, separating for now the issue of sovereignty, if you look at the territories through the prism of one state, you reach a different judgment about what kind of state it is. Mm-hmm. Because if you look at it through the old pair of glasses, which is there's pre-1967 Israel, and then there's a temporary occupation that's on our way to a settlement, right? Sort of two states will come, but now unfortunately, it's painful, but it's just temporary and it's occupation. Then you're looking at Israel through its pre-1967 Israel, which is a flawed democracy. It's certainly not an apartheid state. It's got structural discrimination against minorities. And minorities have most of the rights in that state. And you could say it's a flawed democracy, but not any worse than many other countries around the world. And it certainly would not, you wouldn't apply the term apartheid to it. If you look at it through a new pair of glasses, where Israel controls all of those territories, then what you see is something very different. You see then a increasingly, especially in the past few months with the new government, a codification of a system of Jewish supremacy with a tiered structural discrimination against non-Jews, ranging from one end. Some non-Jews have most but not all rights, to on the other end having segregation, domination, and separation, and very, as we say, akin to apartheid, if it's not apartheid. Analytically, it is. So that's where the judgment comes, because it's once you make the leap that it's one state and you look on that one state through a new pair of glasses, it's very hard to not reach that conclusion. And the word apartheid is distressing to some, and we kind of debate the applicability of that term in there. Particularly, we're not legal scholars. Legal scholars could differ on it, but our point is that word shouldn't be distract us from the fact that whatever you call it, it's pretty bad. That the reality on the ground is pretty bad.
Yes, and on this issue of sovereignty, and this is my last observation, and we'll move on. I mean, it's not a very radical departure from conventions. I mean, the first thing that we study is the distinction between de facto and de jure sovereignty. And you can see that in many parts. Russia's occupation of Crimea, even though not recognized internationally, does exercise de facto sovereignty and authority. We can see in certain parts of Kashmir, they're divided over the states. So yes, so that has existed in the past. But I want to turn to this discussion of whether the Israeli state is apartheid. Once you wear this lens of one state reality, then the question immediately goes, so what kind of citizens are Palestinians of this state? So that is the next logical question. And in the article, as well as in the book, you all contribute a very interesting caste system that seems to exist in this one state reality. And I was hoping that if you could elaborate a little bit on the various categories of discrimination and inclusion and exclusion, legitimation and delegitimation that Israel has to resort to in order to maintain Jewish supremacy within the borders of the territories that Israel controls.
Yeah, and I think that's why we call it a tiered system, because it is tiered and is like a caste system in some ways, where, yes, I mean, citizens of Israel who are non-Jews have most of the rights under the law. Not all the rights. There are things like particularly with the nation state law in 2018 and others, implicit laws that have clearly discriminated against non-Jews, but nonetheless, they have citizenship, and they have most of the rights. They're discriminated against structurally. There's societal discrimination, political discrimination against them, distribution of funds, for example, zoning rights and so forth for their towns and so forth. But nonetheless, they are much closer in rights to the Jews than to other non-Jews in those territories. Then you have people who are Palestinians who are part of the East Jerusalem, which had been annexed by Israel, not recognized by the international community, but annexed by Israel. Some of them have become citizens. Many of the people who apply for citizenship are not given citizenship. Many don't want to apply for citizenship because they don't want to recognize the Israeli annexation. Those who have citizenship have it better off, but even the residents who don't have citizenship have it better off than people who are on the rest of the West Bank, because their mobility within Israel is much easier. But there's always struggle about reestablishing the residency and the questioning about the residency. Then you have people in the West Bank, and they vary from areas that have come out of the Oslo Agreement. They're called Area A, B, and C, with gradation of control by Israel or the Palestinian Authority. They have a little more rights in some areas, like in Area A than in Area C. And then you have people in Gaza who are completely different and excluded from the Israeli state. They're, kind of confined to Gaza with very little right of mobility inside the state. So, all of that is done, obviously, with the gradation. So that's why we say it's a tiered system. So on the one end, you have some non-Jews who have most of the rights, but not all. On the other, you have segregation and separation, like in Gaza, and separation even from each other. That is, to go from one part of the West Bank to another part of the West Bank, even under Palestinian control, you often have to go through Israeli checkpoint. So the mobility part is really important. And that actually leads me to say something. I am now, of course, talking mostly about how we, as the editors, define these issues in our introduction, which was the theoretical introduction. But I remind anybody who's interested in the book to remember we have some superb scholars who contributed to this volume, who actually describe these issues in detail. For example, there's a Hebrew University professor, Yael Berda, that talks about control through mobility, how the mobility regime, is used, meaning the mobility within the territories that are controlled, are used to control and dominate. We have a chapter by Diana Greenwald about sort of how subcontracting domination, how different organizations, including the Palestinian Authority in a way, is subcontracted to address some of those mechanisms of control. So we have a lot of other chapters in the book that deal more specifically with the way this works out on the ground, and adds a lot of depth to what we describe in our own theoretical chapter.
It's not so much in the book, but in the article, you take on this issue head on and quite systematically. In fact, it is a small part of the article, but quite comprehensive, is the enabling role of the United States in this. To put it bluntly, you could argue that if it wasn't for the United States, we would never have had this one state reality, which is so ominous and so, shall we say, destructive to any possibility of peace and stability in the region of Palestinian aspirations to a state. How do we understand? I mean, you have lots of recommendations that you have made to all of this. And I listened to Joe Biden, who said that the central element of his foreign policy is going to be human rights and promotion of democracy. And then he turns around and says at every opportunity that his support for Israel and America's support for Israel is ironclad. I find that term ironclad so troubling, because to me it gives the signal that no matter what you do, we will support you. No matter what you do, we will back you. And Kevin McCarthy was in Israel just yesterday talking about how we have shared values, etc. So how do we deal, even though you talk about the changing opinion of the Democratic Party, how overwhelmingly the Democratic Party has understood this one-state reality. But we have Democrats in power, and there is no change in policy.
I think the enabling part is obviously a point that we make very strongly, both in the article and the book, and we feel strongly about it. And it isn't that we, think that American officials deliberately enabled this. So some people were well-meaning, some people just didn't want to do much with it because it's not a priority. Some people were automatic pilot because it's the easy thing to do. But nonetheless, a lot of American officials, a lot of Americans underestimate the extent to which our policy has enabled the continuation of the occupation and therefore helped entrench what we call the unjust one-state reality. And I think, just to give you an example, it is improbable that Israeli settlements that are obviously have been one reason for the entrenchment of the one-state reality. It is improbable that they would have continued and expanded had the United States not shielded them at the United Nations from resolutions that would have forced costs on violations of international law. And we're not talking about once or twice. We're talking about most of the vetoes employed by the United States in recent decades have been on this issue of Israel. So the United States have used that veto power mostly over this issue to prevent what was an international consensus on applying costs to severe violations of international law. And so that alone is huge. And we know that even recently, when there was a UN resolution being contemplated, the Biden administration went into action trying to prevent it from happening and working to apply pressure, including on the Palestinian Authority itself, to withdraw support for the resolution. And the Palestinian Authority is dependent on American aid, dependent on it's under occupation itself. It's very vulnerable. And it was almost cruel. I mean, separate from it being at odds with the principle of applying international law. But yes, so that's one. The second is, I know a lot of people think about it in terms of money, and obviously Israel has received billions of dollars and continues to receive billions of dollars, but honestly, that's not the main thing. I mean, that's important. So I know there are a lot of people think that it's really about the financial aid, and that's a lot of money, obviously, but it isn't. That's not what enables Israel. It's more about the technological edge, the extent to which the United States shares cutting edge technology in the military and intelligence arena to give Israel the absolute edge over any combined set of enemies in the Middle East. That's obviously what has given Israel the ability to maintain dominance and therefore to feel comfortable about what it does in the occupied territory. So the U.S. clearly plays a significant role in that. And finally, if you look at the idea that Israel can have its cake and eat it too, meaning what? Meaning it can prevail in its occupation of the Palestinians and at the very same time make peace with the Arab states. Without any costs or without having to make any compromises, that has been also misunderstood because almost all the agreements between the Arab states and Israel, dating back to the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, and then the Jordanian-Israeli Treaty, and then the Abraham Accords, all of these agreements were first and foremost about the United States of America. Arabs were trying to reach out and respond to the United States much more than trying to make peace with Israel. So the American role in all of these is indispensable. These agreements would never have happened without the American role. And yet the United States, except for Jimmy Carter when he tried to extract some concessions on the Palestinian issue, and obviously he didn't have a chance to follow up after since he didn't get reelected, no one really insisted on tying this to progress on the Palestinian issue. And so that obviously, in our opinion, the Abraham Accords in the end, whatever the purpose was for them on this issue, they empowered the far right in Israel, which has been arguing we don't have to compromise on the West Bank. We look at the Arabs are making peace with, and the Biden administration adopted the Abraham Accords and actually tried to expand them to Saudi Arabia without tying them in any shape or form to progress on the Palestinian issue. So when you take all these three together and you put it in perspective, historical perspective, you get a sense that basically these have helped divorce the Israel-Palestine issue, the occupation issue, from Israeli successes in the region, and they would never have happened without an American role.
You kind of anticipated my next question, which was about the Abrahamic Accords. Given the role of the United States, putting that aside, isn't it also essentially a signal that the Arab states are saying that we are tired of the Palestinian issue? We want to go beyond the Palestinian issue. Can we not relate with Israel as well as Western countries without having this burden of fighting for the Palestinian statehood or Palestinian rights? In fact, there's a lot of pressure, even on Pakistan is feeling the pressure to recognize Israel and normalize relations with Israel. So it seems that we have gone from trying to find justice for the Palestinians to justifying the occupation, and then moving on to a situation where we are saying that the occupation is normal and it's time for the rest of the world to normalize their relationship with Israel. Even India's position with regards to Israel has changed. So a post-colonial state like India is kind of accepting the colonial reality of Israeli occupation of Palestine. So in that case, how much of a damage or contribution or contributor is the Abrahamic Accords and the signals that at least the West is reading from Arab states that, well, we can ignore the Palestinian issue and continue with the global agenda?
Look, you have to look through the noise. The noise is this rhetoric that you mentioned. People are tired of the Palestinian issue and they don't want anything to do with it, and they want to move on. I think that's a rhetoric, and I say that because at the public level, we don't really have any indication that the Arab public is less supportive of the Palestinians. Palestinians is not a priority for people, obviously, whether it's in Morocco or Egypt. They have their own lives. They have their own troubles. Look at Syria, a devastated country, or Yemen, or whatever. But what we see is that Palestinian issues still resonate with the public as an identity issue. And we've seen lots of manifestation of that recently, most recently in the World Cup in Doha, Qatar, when the Moroccans in their moment of celebration, they wrapped themselves in a Palestinian flag, even though their country had just made peace with Israel, right? So I think, first of all, we don't really see any real transformation of the public. We do see in social media attempts to tell a different story. We can't tell how much of it is driven by governments, how much of it is genuine that's taken place. So let's set that aside. Second, I think that Arab governments have never prioritized Palestine as their key issue. That is a myth. And frankly, they have the right to do their own thing. So let's say with the Abraham Accords, principally, this was a UAE-Israel agreement, then obviously expanded. If the UAE had not done it, no one else would have done it, right? So the UAE obviously is doing it for its own strategic reasons. and as a sovereign state, and it's doing, it has strategic interests that go beyond the Palestinian issue, as all states do. I mean, one doesn't blame them for looking after their strategic interests, right? In this case, they placed a lot of stock in the relationship with the U.S. They rewarded the Trump administration for its support, and may have thought that this could help it even in the election. But also, they knew that scored points even with the Democrats, because the Democrats were also supportive of peace, and obviously, particularly since they took credit for Israel not annexing officially the parts of the West Bank. So they were trying to score their own points, and as all of Arab states have in the past. I think this is not particularly unique. The question for us is not whether states will do what they want to do. It is whether, number one, what they do has a negative consequence on this very issue, or whether it wasn't their power to be able to create a connection that would help. Because even if the UAE is doing it for its own strategic interests, it's public sympathize with the Palestinians, and the Arabs were, to the extent possible, since the Saudi initiative, so the Arab initiative that was originally Saudi initiative, the last couple of decades have been focused more on, if Israel withdraws from the occupied territories, all Arabs would make peace with it. That was a principle, at least, that created a linkage. And so there was a divorce here that took place. So in that sense, I think that's new. The degree to which there was a divorce from the Palestinian issue, that's new. Is this likely to happen beyond this case? It's hard to know. I mean, obviously the Saudis have hedged their bets. The Israelis feel that the biggest prize for them is to make peace with Saudi Arabia without any compromises on the Palestinian issue. The Saudis, up until now, have resisted that. Whether they're resisting in order to extract something of their own, or whether they're resisting because they feel their public doesn't want them to do anything that jeopardize the Palestinian issue, that remains to be seen.
To me, it is very depressing that there seems to be no correspondence between Arab states' policies and the views of the Arab street. But let's come back into the US and ask this question, given the fact that the United States now is far less stable domestically. Since January 6th, we have our own issues of tendencies towards populism, and there is a steady decline of human rights and even democratic values in the United States itself. And so will the US continue this, or do you anticipate a fundamental change in US public opinion? I think the biggest barrier to Palestinian statehood has been American foreign policy and the public opinion in the United States, more than the public opinion in the Arab world. So even though there are data that suggests that the public opinion in the United States is changing, given our own problems, do you think that this shift in the Democratic Party, as well as in young Americans, especially among young Jewish Americans, is there any hope that we might see a more balanced American foreign policy after Biden?
As you know, I've been doing public opinion polls for decades in the US on this issue, and I've just released a new one this week, actually, that I did an article last week in the Brookings Institution on this issue, where there is clearly a shift taking place in American public opinion, and it's mostly among Democrats, but interestingly, even among Republicans, because young Republicans now, according to our polls, are less supportive of Israel than older Republicans, and young evangelicals even are considerably less supportive of Israel than older evangelicals. And that, as you know, is a very important constituency. But the big story is taking place among Democrats. And let me give you an example just in the most recent poll. So we asked people how they would describe Israel right now. And we gave them four choices. The first choice was a vibrant democracy, then a flawed democracy, then a state with minority rights restrictions, and finally, a state with segregation similar to apartheid. And keep in mind that typically the Israel issue is constant in America. It's a political issue, particularly among Republicans, invoked often in presidential, debates, and often Israel is described as the only democracy in the Middle East, or with reference, quote, to shared values, unquote, with the United States. So, Israel Israeli assumption about Israeli democracy has been highlighted in the American political discourse. And yet what we found is something really striking, which is that a majority of Americans said they didn't know if Israel is a democracy. And that includes 2/3 of Republicans who said they didn't know if Israel is a democracy. And among those who presented an opinion, who gave an opinion, the number of people overall, including Republicans, Independents, and Democrats, a number of people who said it was a state with segregation similar to apartheid equaled the number of people who said it's a flawed democracy. Those are the two top vote getters. And among Democrats, a plurality of those who responded, 44%, said it was a state with segregation similar to apartheid. And only 6% Democrats says a vibrant democracy. Now, that's really quite striking, honestly, both in terms of how many people said they didn't know, and then of those who said they knew, the extent to which the vision of Israel is far less democratic than it has been assumed, but especially among Democrats. So I think there's a shift. And honestly, it surprised me, even as someone who does a lot of public opinion polling. I've never asked this question in the past. I didn't think the terminology about apartheid had actually gotten into the public discourse. I knew it was more among analysts and scholars, but that's new. There is a shift taking place, and we've seen the Gallup poll recently, which showed that the first time in their years of polling, Democrats say they sympathize with the Palestinians more than they sympathize with the Israelis. And that's not just young Democrats, it's old Democrats, by 11 percentage points. I mean, that's really quite a remarkable shift taking place, something akin to what we have been finding in our own polling. So yes, there is a shift, and I think that shift has been felt. I've been doing polling, for example, on how the Biden administration reacts. Their Democratic constituency think they're far more pro-Israel than they are. And they've been critical, particularly in the 2021 Gaza war. I did a lot of polling with the young Democrats in particular were very frustrated with the way the Biden administration had behaved. But I could tell you two things about why there's this gap. There is this gap because obviously this is not an important strategic issue for Americans now, right? We've got the battle for democracy at home. We've got the Ukraine war. We've got the economy. We've got all these issues, and we get race issues and things in America that, we all, as Americans, yes, I focus on Israel, Palestine as an analyst, but honestly, all these other issues are so important to me as an American. And I'm, when I'm going to vote, I'm going to, am I going to vote for Biden or am I going to vote for Trump? No matter what Biden does on this issue, it's a no-brainer for me personally, right? And I think that's true for a lot of Americans. But don't underestimate how much presidents can make a difference. A lot of this has to do with the president himself in this particular case. Had Bernie Sanders gotten elected, he would have had a lot more leeway to do things differently. I don't think we would necessarily have. I don't think he would have worked hard to block a resolution against the settlements at the United Nations. For example, just to give you one example, he's obviously been arguing for conditioning aid to Israel. And he was close to getting elected. I mean, he was close to becoming the Democratic candidate. In the same way that I would have said, had Al Gore gotten elected instead of George W. Bush, in 2000, I don't think he would have taken the United States to war with Iraq. So I don't underestimate the extent to which presidents matter. In this particular case, I think the president himself is much more pro-Israel than the Democratic constituency. And I say that, I put that in quotation mark, because I think many Israelis think that's not the way to be pro-Israel. More, let's say, more enabling of Israeli policy, or more reluctant to take action that creates tension with a sitting Israeli government than others. So when you ask about change, I don't divorce that change from personalities. If any of the Republican candidates win next time, doesn't matter who they are, you can bet that they're going to be more embracing of the Israeli right and more overlooking of the Palestinian rights than any Democrat who will get elected. And on the Democratic side right now, we're only going to have one candidate. Honestly, it's going to be Biden. And therefore, the likely shift in any foreseeable future is not huge.
So basically what you're saying, and this is probably a very sad note to end this discussion on, is that America is now like the Arab world. Government policies towards Arab-Israeli issue are not in sync with its citizens. And so what's the point of having a democracy if state policies don't reflect? Professor Telhami, thank you very much for talking to us. For the viewers, I'm going to post links, one to the Amazon page of this book. I will also post a link to Professor Shibley Telhami's Amazon page. I will also post a link to the latest polling that he was talking about at the Brookings Institution. And I forgot to tell you, I used to be a fellow at Brookings. So for disclosure purposes, and I will post a link to this article in the video description. I recommend very strongly that you at least read the article in the Council on Foreign Relations, because the least it is going to do is trigger an intense dialogue, at least among the academia as well as the policy community on the reality of Israel-Palestine. So Professor Telhami, thank you very much once again for joining us on Khanversations. And viewers, please, if you have not subscribed to Khanversations, do subscribe to it, ring the bell icon, like the video, make sure you share it with your social network.
Thank you very much for hosting me.
Thank you, sir.